All right. This is for St. Augustine and the origin of good and evil. We started in on some of this conversation about Augustine on Monday. It's Wednesday, and we're picking up with what Augustine has to talk about here. Remember that he began his formation in a lot of this material as a Neoplatonist in this dualistic light and dark kind of universe. And what he's seeking to do is understand around this new concept of absolutes challenged by people like Ambrose and some of these others, exactly how we talk about God, his existence and essence, and the implications that has as we then transition and begin to discuss issues of morality, good and evil. Because of the background in St. Augustine's life, his struggle with self-discipline and his self-indulgence and his problem with morality, what he will understand as problems with morality in his Christian walk and life. He really wants to drill into the intellectual of what is evil really, where does it come from, why is it here, so that as a Christian and as a Christ follower, he can live in this confessed faith as best as is possible. And so where we looked at the monastic orders, and they began with this idea of relationship with God as our starting point, holiness and righteousness is our pursuit, because that is what God calls us to, and we move forward from there in this intellectual growth. Augustine's approach here is let's begin with the intellectual growth, and then the life of faith will follow when we know the truth. And that, again, this is Platonic, right? He's heavily influenced by, in order to live out the truth, you have to know the truth. Sort of Plato's version of know right, do rightly. Augustine recognizes that the knowing right and the doing right aren't necessarily automatic. Just because I know the right thing to do doesn't mean I am going to do the right thing. But I cannot do the right thing if I don't know what it is. And that's more Augustine. It's not knowing the right thing is automatically doing the right thing. It's that I can't do the right thing unless I know what it is. And so he begins to press into this concept of right and wrong, good and bad, and really what he's going to talk about is good and evil here. And so he begins with this. God is the essence of complete existence. And that means sort of two things for him. Number one, God exists by default. God is the source of God's own existence. And so there is this kind of completeness to God because he's self-causing. Shades of Aristotle's unmoved mover here, right? So part of this is this idea that God exists in and of God's self. And existence itself is a byproduct of God. It's not that God somehow exists because there is this thing that is existence. Existence is what it is because God is what God is. And that's kind of the starting point. The second piece to this complete existence is that in the truest sense of existing, in the most substantial sense of existing, this is how God exists. So, that point, as a subpoint, has some pieces attached to it. So, one, God's existence is complete in the sense that existence is what it is because of God. God is the substance that exists. And from that substance, all other things exist. And so anything else that we want to talk about as having a form, a substance, some kind of existence, we have to first begin with God's existence. In other words, everything else that properly exists is derived from God. God then, because he is the complete essence of existence itself, and because he is the only substantial existence in and of itself, as a self-causing, self-existing thing, then only God is the ultimate source or the supreme good in all of the universe or beyond it. Good comes from God. Good is defined by God's essence and nature. We describe God as good because that is how we experience him. But Augustine says, properly speaking, goodness is a byproduct of God's existence. Like existence itself is a byproduct of who God is. So too, the biblical depictions of God as good are accurate because good is defined by God's essence, nature, and character, not the other way around. We do not define God as good because he does good things. God does good things because he is the essence of what it is to be good. You cannot, in St. Augustine's understanding here, you cannot define anything as good without talking about God. Source, origin of it, its character, nature, essence, whatever. If God is not part of it, it's not good. That's it. That's the end of it. And so when God creates in Genesis chapter 1 and he says it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good, cool. That means everything that's in existence at that point is good only. And only good things exist because this God made all things good because this God is good. The essence and nature of what goodness is. So God's actions as good actions are defined by God's nature and essence, not necessarily because we see God do good things. God's going to do good things almost kind of like by default. He can only do good things. And so those things that we describe as good now are good because they have come from God. That means then that evil, sin would fall into this category as well, is a lack of good. Which is fine. It's like darkness is the absence or the lack of light, and it's like cold is the absence or the lack of heat. Evil then is not a made thing. It's an imperfection. It's an abdication of some good thing. So, a lack of God's presence produces disruptions in peace. Peace is the good thing. Non-peace, discord, strife, whatever form or descriptor we take for it, is the bad or the evil. It's not a thing, it's the absence of God's good thing, which is peace. So God's presence is the ultimate good. Our right relationship with God, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and God's presence with us as human beings is the ultimate good thing for human life. We, as free will beings, can choose to do things that are outside of God's design, intentions, peace, moral standard, or whatever. And when we do those things that fall outside of that boundary or that work in opposition to God's good thing, we then have experience of something that we would call as evil or bad or corrupt. And corruption is probably actually a really good word for this. Augustine understands that evil is a corruption. It's some sort of deficiency of God's intended good thing. So like peace, for example. A lack of harmony between two people is a disruption to God's intention for peace in right relationship between people. This disruption in peace is an absence of the Spirit who brings peace, of God who provides all of creation with this peaceful coexistence. It's not until humanity chooses outside of God's design for creation, Genesis chapter 3 and the fall, that then chaos and conflict between Adam and Eve, and conflict between Eve and the serpent, and conflict between Adam and the ground. None of that conflict exists prior to humanity's choice to do something outside of God's intended good thing for Adam and Eve. So here's the deal. Evil, then, is not a thing. It does not exist. It is a condition wherein our existence has been corrupted. Evil is a dysfunction. It's an absence of the good things that God has provided to us, for us, in us, amongst us, fill in blank. So, I lost the analogy I wanted here, but only God exists truly and rightly and properly and of any kind of substance. So then, evil is not a substance, it's not a thing, it does not exist. It is a condition in which there is some corruption or deficiency or dysfunction with what God has put in place that is the good thing. That's evil. Augustine goes one step further, and then he says this. Absolute evil, in contrast to absolute good, which Augustine would do this. God is the absolute good all the time. We do good when we approach God's absolute goodness. We do evil when our good is corrupted by something. Absolute evil, then, would have to be non-existence, because God exists essentially. The absence of that essential existence, which would be the opposite of God, is non-existence. Back the truck up a little bit here. Remember this. God exists out of his own essence. God causes existence. Exodus chapter 3, and the name of God given to Moses. I am, and the implication in the Hebrew is that this God's name is, quote, the one who causes to be, the one who causes existence, the self-existent one. Okay, so if God exists essentially and produces existence out of himself, then the absolute evil would actually be complete non-existence. So, it works like this. God is the full expression of what is good, and he gives existence its existence. Things are only living because God has given them existence. 2, our moral choices are good when they are in line with God's standard and understanding of what is good. When our choices are in line with God's character, nature, and person, we do good. When there is some corruption, either in motivation or in action, of our attempts at good, then we have this dysfunction, corruption, or lesser than that, this absence of God's perfect good, perfection, that absence is evil. Absolute evil would be for us to not exist. Because God's essence is to make things exist. So that means this: God as good and as self-causing only ever has one intention, and that is to create us. Because to not create us would violate his essence as creator. Okay? Hopefully that is making some semblance of sense. So here's how this, one more time. God has created all things because essentially God is the origin of life itself. So then, for God to not create humanity as an expression of his self-existence and his self-causingness, that would be a deficiency in his essence if, again, he were to not create us. So where we land here is God creates us as the good expression of his good nature because he is the source of existence. Okay? Evil then is a choice for us morally. Evil is a choice that we engage as something less than God's concepts, standards, paradigms of perfect goodness for us. Pause and think for a second. So then, here's where we land. God creates all things. God has a purpose, a will, and a plan for everything he creates, because it is his essence and nature to create. Those plans, purposes, wills, those are all good, because God is all good, only good. However, God has made beings, human beings and angelic beings, with free will. Because to force the choice of God's good intention is not good. In part because it creates what we would talk about is like it makes us robots. And in part because to reflect God means that we act by choice and by compulsion. God is compelled to create because he is in essence creator. He chooses to manufacture creatively what he has created. Same is true for us. So then we as free beings in the image of God can choose other than God's good, perfect will, plan, desire, intention for us. However, by doing that, we become less than God's design. We become, or we choose to become, corrupt, deficient. Actually, probably the better word is dysfunctional. We actually become less than God's version of what it is to be human when we don't do the good things he has told us to do. Anything less than God's goodness is evil. Evil is the absence of God's good in our life and situations. God's character and nature demands that his image and likeness do good, however. We choose what is a dysfunctional or what is a corrupted version of that perfect good all the time. The absolute evil for us would be to not exist. Because the most basic and fundamental good in us is that we do exist. So, Augustine has us here. Morality is a choice between the virtue, which is God's perfect goodness for us, and the vice, which is some deficiency of God's perfect goodness for us. And here, while he started rather Plato-based, Augustine now sounds like Aristotle. Virtue and vice for Aristotle is the balance of the two in morality. So we should not be too bold, because then we won't be wise. We'll be rash. We should not be too slow to process, because then we won't act. And so the balance is process enough that you have the right answer and then execute the right answer. What Augustine says is actually that works better if you take the virtues and say that God has oriented the virtues toward God's perfect goodness, and all of our vices are shortcomings of God's perfect version of that virtue. So the perfect version of what's the one I'm looking for? Courage. The perfect version of courage takes into account the fact that courage needs the time to process what is best to do, and then emboldens us to do it because we now know the good we ought to do. However, Augustine is honest about the fact that while this is true of our reality, it is really hard for us to do that. Something in us inclines us to, rather consistently, what is less than God's good. And so he kind of creates this sliding scale so that we understand it a little bit better. And he says that there is this understanding of knowledge from what is natural to what is God's grace to what is God's truth. And we ought to progress towards God's goodness from the natural to the gift to the truth. So it works a bit like this. What God created in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is natural and good. What God has gifted us in salvation, he will perfect in eternity. What God allows us in philosophy, he gifts us in revelation and theology, so that in perfection we would know the nature of God. Reason is natural. Faith is God's gift to believe in things even when we can't understand them. And knowledge is definite and perfect, which means for Augustine, we don't actually know anything until we are perfected in the presence of God. And then we will know and be fully known. This language from Paul. And so what has been revealed to us generally in human reason, in philosophy, in the creation of the world, this is all what is natural. And they're good because God didn't make anything that wasn't good. But what is present to us in the grace, the gift of God, in salvation, in Christian theology, in faith, and in the special revelation of the texts of Scripture is closer to the truth, which only occurs in God's perfected space. So God's perfection, the full disclosure of his nature, and the full knowledge of God is truth that we can only ever get to when we are face to face with God. And so we move through this process, and as we move through this process, God is at work recreating us, refashioning us to return what was part of nature but has been corrupted or made dysfunctional by sin back to its design, which God put in place as only good. So here's where we land. God created us. We are not what we were intended to be. And so if we have faith, God is at work recreating us, transforming us back toward his original good. And so we have to confess where we are dysfunctional, where we are corrupted, where we are deficient from God's intended goodness, and submit to God's process of recreating us to replace what is deficient in God's goodness with what is perfect in God's goodness. And so this life, this world, is constantly redirecting our moral attentions back to God so that we can see the divine, even if our perceptions of what is divine aren't fully disclosed yet. Because then we can see it, and we can learn about it, and we can grow toward it. We can identify the lack of good in our lives, know that it is evil, and then move away from that toward God's goodness, towards God's perfect design. This world, Augustine says, because of its corruption and its dysfunction, is not to be enjoyed. God is the only thing to be enjoyed because he is the only good thing we have in this world. Everything in this world that is good is a direct result of God and his presence in this world. The presence and work of the divine in this world is what we are to enjoy. And so at every turn, we are to reject the lack of God's goodness in the world around us and embrace God's goodness in the world he intended. All of this culminates in this peace for him, where peace is found in confession. And he has three parts to this idea of confession. And this is all related to his understanding of what is and what is not evil. And so this is kind of where we will end. First, humanity has to confess sin. We admit our guilt, our mistake, our misstep, our corruption and dysfunction of God's good. We cannot let go of those evils in us, those habits, those dysfunctions, those deficiencies, those corruptions, until we admit it and confess it. We have to admit and confess our sin to be forgiven and to move forward from it as a kind of almost therapeutic healing effect. In other words, we only really heal from the evil things we do as habits when we confess them so that we can identify them, not repeat them, and we do those things with God so that he will forgive and help us move away from them, because we have to own our mistake first. The second piece to this, the confession of praise. We confess our sin, faulty, corrupt, and then we confess praise. This is what we owe God in worship, and it is the truth we should speak to as much as we can and as much as we know in the here and now. We offer to God the truth we know of him in gratitude to the utmost of our ability, because it is proper and right for us to speak of God as he is in essence. And our lives should reflect that as acts of worship and confession before God. The last confession is the confession of cooperation. So first, We confess our sin, we own and admit our guilt, and we seek forgiveness and the effect of not continuing in that guilt. Then is the confession of praise, where we owe God the truth about who and what God is, and so we speak it with gratitude and with enthusiasm and with sincerity to lead us into the confession of cooperation, where God says, okay, if you are in this position where you live corrupted by, fill in the blank, then your task is to surrender your understandings and your will toward the good, toward mine, wherein I will replace them with what is best. So then you give up and actively surrender these things, and God replaces them with what he wants that is best for you. So, an example from Augustine. He says, the indulgence of this life should be avoided. So things like marriage and sex, we ignore. Ignore is a bad word. We avoid them in order to embrace a life completely dedicated to God. Furthermore, we give up stuff, material possession, in order to engage with God and surrender to his will so that he has complete charge over all of what we possess and have. This participation with God's will is completely voluntary. We have to actively surrender to his work in recreating us and remaking us. So we admit our sin. We bring praise and worship before God. And we surrender ourselves so that God replaces what is deficient and corrupted in us with his goodness to the best of his ability. Notice it's to the best of God's ability. This is, for Augustine, when we do this the way we are intended, this is a no-brainer. It is not any effort on our part other than the effort it takes to surrender our wills to God. And it's not any effort on God's part because he made us in the first place, and so remaking us, not a problem at all. Okay, hopefully that's clear, at least to some extent. We will pick up with Augustine as we carry forward. You are going to end up in a place wherein you write your own version of this kind of confessions. Remember Augustine's 3 primary confessions. Confess sin, confess praise to God, surrender of the will. As you read his confessions, note the kinds of things Augustine is confessing to. Some of it is sin, some of it is past habits, some of it is all of that. Other pieces of it are these confessions of praise and faith and surrender to the will of God. So just pay attention as you take a look at that. Okay? Until next time.